All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something I think a lot of you are interested in, and that is speaking English more fluently. We've got a great episode here from the Speak English Fluently podcast, just packed with tips.
Yeah, fluency is one of those things that I think a lot of language learners maybe misunderstand a little bit.
Yeah.
It's not about being perfect. It's not about having, a perfect accent.
Right.
It's really just about getting your meaning across clearly and naturally in a way that you feel comfortable and confident.
Yeah, and our hosts, James and Clara, they were really clear about that. It's not about becoming some kind of perfect English-speaking robot. They even said,
Yeah.
It's more like jazz. There's a structure there, but there's also room to improvise and be creative.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And it is a skill. It's something that develops over time. And I think
Right.
this is important that they emphasize that it involves understanding other speakers and how to respond appropriately. It's not just about you speaking. It's about understanding the whole flow of conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
So one of their first big tips was this idea of actually thinking in English.
Yes.
And they gave this example of you're imagining yourself making coffee in the morning, and you're thinking like, okay, the water's boiling. Now I need to grab a mug, all in English.
Right.
I don't know, is that realistic? I mean, can people really just switch their thinking over like that?
Well, it sounds a little strange at first, but there's actually research to back this up.
Yeah.
When we translate in our heads, it slows us down.
Right.
And so thinking directly in English helps our brains to get used to forming those sentences naturally.
Okay, so it's more about training your brain
Exactly.
to operate in English.
Yeah, it's like learning to draw. At first you're thinking about every single step, but eventually it just becomes automatic.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And then to kind of build on that idea,
Yeah.
they were really big on the importance of daily speaking practice.
Yes.
Even if it means talking to yourself.
That's right.
Like narrating your day like I'm walking the dog or it's time to make dinner.
Exactly.
Doesn't that seem a little weird, though?
Maybe at first, but remember we talked about confidence.
Right.
When you practice alone, it removes that fear of judgment.
Okay.
You're free to make mistakes and experiment and just get comfortable with the sounds of the language.
So it's kind of like a safe space to practice.
Exactly. It's like a musician practicing scales before a big concert.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I like that. Now, this next technique, shadowing, I've actually tried this one before.
Oh, yeah.
This is where you listen to a native speaker, like in a podcast or a video, and you try to mimic their intonation and rhythm.
Right.
Even like the little pauses.
Every day.
James and Clara gave the example of repeating a phrase like, how's it going?
Right.
Right after you hear it.
Yeah.
And it feels really strange at first,
It does.
but it's actually kind of fun.
Yeah. And it's really effective.
Yeah.
Because you're not just learning the words, you're learning how to say them naturally.
Right. So you're learning the music of the language.
Exactly like learning to paint by copying the brushstrokes of a master.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
One thing that really resonated with me was their emphasis on focusing on learning phrases,
Yes.
not just individual words.
That's so important.
They gave examples instead of just learning the word good, learn good job, good to see you. That's a good idea.
Exactly.
Those kinds of things. And I have to admit, I always struggle with this. I tend to get stuck translating word for word.
I understand that's a very common habit for language learners.
Yeah.
But think about it this way. Learning phrases gives you those ready-made building blocks for conversations.
Okay.
You don't have to pause and construct every sentence from scratch.
Right.
It's like having pre-chopped veggies when you're cooking.
Okay, that's a good analogy.
It just makes the whole process smoother and faster.
Yeah, it's like having those phrases right there on the tip of your tongue, ready to go.
Exactly.
James and Clara, they also suggested this idea of recording yourself speaking.
Yes.
Maybe pick a topic and just talk about it for a few minutes. Do you think this really helps? I mean, who wants to listen to themselves ramble on?
I know it can be a little awkward at first.
Yeah.
But listening back is a really powerful tool.
Okay.
It helps you to identify areas where you can improve.
Right.
You can track your progress, and it can actually boost your confidence
Okay.
as you hear yourself getting better over time.
So it's more about self-awareness
Exactly.
and kind of being able to pinpoint those areas where you need a little extra practice.
Yeah, it's like watching game film after a match.
Right. You can see what you did wrong and how to improve.
Exactly.
Now, they did something really clever. I thought they had a role play scenario.
Oh, yes.
to kind of demonstrate these techniques in action.
Yeah.
So they had this scenario where a student was asking a teacher for advice on how to improve their fluency.
Mm-hmm.
And they covered a lot of things we've been talking about: thinking in English, shadowing native speakers, finding opportunities to practice.
Yeah, role-playing is a fantastic way to practice for real-life conversations.
Right.
It's a nice low-pressure environment where you can try out different approaches.
It was really cool to hear those tips,
Yeah.
actually being put into practice in a conversation.
Absolutely, and it's something you can do on your own as well.
Oh, okay.
Think about common situations you might encounter.
Right.
And create your own little role-plays.
So it's kind of like rehearsing for a play.
Exactly.
But the stage is your everyday life.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a cool way to look at it.
Yeah.
But, even with all these great tips, it's easy to get discouraged.
Oh, yeah.
James and Clara, they talked about some of the common challenges that learners face, like the fear of making mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can all relate to that.
Of course.
I know I've definitely been in situations where I was so worried about sounding silly or saying the wrong thing that I just clammed up.
It's completely understandable.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Making mistakes is an essential part of learning any skill.
Right.
Especially languages.
Yeah.
You can't let the fear of making mistakes hold you back.
And they were very reassuring about that. They basically said, look, everyone makes mistakes.
Right, even native speakers.
Even native speakers make mistakes.
But don't let it hold you back.
It's part of the process.
Exactly.
They also talked about this tendency to speak too fast.
Yes.
Which I am definitely guilty of.
It's a common one.
I get so excited, to finally be speaking.
Right.
That the words just all come tumbling out in this big jumbled mess.
It happens, but fluency isn't about speed.
Right.
It's about clarity.
Right.
It's better to speak slowly and clearly than to rush through and be misunderstood.
That's a good point. And they had a great tip. If you're struggling to find the right word, paraphrase. Just find another way to say it.
Exactly. Keep the conversation flowing.
Yeah.
Don't get stuck.
And they had a whole bunch of other great tips. Things like joining conversation groups, reading aloud, immersing yourself in English media. But before we dive into those, I think it's time for a little break. We'll be right back with more from Speak English Fluently.
Sounds good. Welcome back. And, before the break, we were talking about some of the challenges that language learners face.
Yeah.
And I think one that we often overlook is this pressure to sound like a native speaker.
Oh, yeah. I know that feeling.
Yeah.
It's like there's this invisible standard out there that you're constantly trying to reach.
Right.
And it can be really discouraging.
And the truth is, even native speakers have different accents and dialects.
Yeah.
There's no one correct way to speak English.
Mm-hmm.
What matters most is that you can communicate clearly and effectively.
So it's more about finding your own voice in English.
Exactly.
Rather than trying to sound like somebody else.
That's right. And that's where things like, intonation and rhythm, even humor are coming to play.
Right.
These things add personality to your speech.
Yeah, if you think about like someone who's a really captivating speaker,
Mm-hmm.
it's not just about the words that they're saying.
Right.
It's the way that they say them, the pauses, the emphasis.
Exactly.
It's almost like a performance.
Absolutely it is. And just like any performance, it takes practice to find your own unique style.
Okay.
And one thing that can really help is being a good listener.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have immediately connected listening with fluency.
Yeah, active listening is so important because it helps you to pick up on those nuances of conversation,
Mm-hmm.
the tone of voice, the body language, the unspoken messages.
Right. So you're not just hearing the words, you're paying attention to the whole picture.
Exactly. And the better you become at active listening, the more naturally you'll be able to respond and keep those conversations flowing.
It's like a dance where each partner is kind of responding to the other's movements.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah. And something we haven't really touched on yet is this idea of cultural awareness.
Oh, yes.
English is spoken in so many different countries,
That's right.
and each one has its own set of customs and communication styles.
Absolutely. And what might be considered polite or appropriate in one culture could be completely different in another.
Right.
So being mindful of those differences can really help you to avoid misunderstandings.
It's like learning the unspoken rules of a new game.
Yeah,
You have to understand the context to play effectively.
exactly.
So circling back to some of those practical tips that James and Clara shared,
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of thinking in English.
Okay.
I've tried it a few times, and I have to admit, it's a lot harder than it sounds.
It takes effort.
Yeah.
It really does. It's like training your brain to operate in a new language.
Right.
But the more you do it, the easier it becomes.
Yep.
And there are little tricks you can use to help you along the way. For example, you can try changing the language settings on your phone or your computer to English.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Just those little things can make a big difference.
Yeah, like surrounding yourself with those little reminders.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to be perfect.
Right.
Even if you can only manage a few minutes at a time, it's still progress.
It's about building those muscles.
Yes.
Little by little.
Little by little.
Now, another technique they mentioned that I thought was really interesting was shadowing.
Oh, yeah.
I've dabbled in this before, and it's surprisingly fun.
It can be, and it's so effective for improving your pronunciation, your rhythm intonation.
Yeah.
It's like learning to dance by following in the footsteps of a professional dancer.
Wow.
You're mimicking their movements to develop your own grace and fluidity.
So you're not just learning the steps, you're learning the style and the feel.
Exactly.
I have to confess, I've always struggled with this idea of learning phrases instead of individual words. I tend to translate word for word in my head, which I know slows me down.
I understand that's a very common habit,
Yeah.
but it can create a mental bottleneck.
Right.
Learning phrases helps you to chunk information together so you don't have to constantly pause and search for individual words.
Okay.
It's like having a toolbox full of pre-assembled parts
Right.
instead of having to build everything from scratch every time.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah,
So it's about being prepared, having those phrases ready to go.
exactly.
Another technique they talked about that I've been a little hesitant to try is recording myself speaking.
I know it can feel awkward, but trust me, it's one of the most powerful tools for self-improvement.
Really?
It's like having a mirror for your spoken English.
Okay.
You can hear things that you wouldn't notice otherwise, like pronunciation errors, awkward pauses, or places where you tend to rush.
So it's not about being critical of yourself.
Right.
It's about being objective.
Exactly. And it's incredibly motivating to hear yourself improve over time. It's like tracking your progress in a workout journal. You can see how far you've come and where you still need to focus your efforts.
Yeah, I could definitely see the value in that.
Yeah.
James and Clara also emphasized, the importance of finding opportunities to practice English in your daily life.
Yes.
They talked about things like narrating your day, even if it's just in your head.
Right.
Surrounding yourself with English as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Podcasts, movies, books, music.
Absolutely. It's all about creating an immersive environment.
Yeah.
Where English is constantly present. Think of it like learning to swim. You wouldn't just read a book about swimming, you would jump in the pool and start practicing.
Right. So it's about finding ways to make English a part of your everyday life.
Exactly.
Not just something you study in isolation.
That's right. And the more you can incorporate it into your routine, the more natural and effortless it will become.
And one of the most practical tips I thought was to join conversation groups or find language exchange partners. It's like taking your English skills out for a test drive in the real world.
Absolutely. And it's a fantastic way to meet new people, share experiences, and learn from each other.
Yeah. And it's a great way to overcome that fear of speaking.
That's right, because everyone in the group is there for the same reason, to practice and improve.
It's like a safe space to make mistakes, experiment, and build confidence.
Exactly.
And one thing that really resonated with me was their emphasis on enjoying the process of language learning.
It's so important.
Yeah.
It shouldn't feel like a chore. It should be an adventure.
Right. It's about those moments of connection.
Yes.
Those aha moments when something finally clicks.
Exactly.
And you know that satisfaction of knowing that you're constantly expanding your horizons.
And one of the things I find most rewarding about language learning is that it's a lifelong pursuit.
Yeah.
There's always something new, to learn some new nuance, to discover some new way to express yourself.
It's like exploring a vast uncharted territory. And the more you explore, the more you realize how much more there is to see.
And that sense of wonder and curiosity is what keeps language learning fresh and engaging no matter how long you've been studying.
It's like having a key to unlock new worlds, new cultures, new ways of thinking.
Absolutely. Language learning is about so much more than just communicating in another language.
Mm-hmm.
It's about expanding your perspective, challenging your assumptions, connecting with people from all walks of life.
And that's a journey that can enrich your life in countless ways.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on for part 2 of our fluency deep dive.
Welcome back. As we've been talking about all these tips from Speak English Fluently, it's really struck me that fluency isn't just about, perfect grammar or having this huge vocabulary.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about using language as a tool to connect with people.
Yeah, I think there's this misconception that fluency is purely mechanical. It's pronunciation, it's grammar, it's vocabulary. But what really makes communication special is that human element, the ability to really express yourself and build that rapport.
It's almost like you can have all the right ingredients for a delicious cake.
Uh-huh.
But without that special touch, that personal flair, it's just not going to be as memorable.
I love that analogy. And it's about finding your own voice in English,
Right.
infusing it with your personality, your humor, your unique perspective.
Yeah. And one thing that really struck me from the episode was this emphasis on being a good listener,
Yes.
which might seem kind of counterintuitive, but they really stressed how important active listening is for becoming a more fluent speaker.
It makes sense, though, when you think about it, because conversations are a two-way street.
Right.
And if you're so focused on what you're going to say next, you miss out on all those subtle cues, those unspoken signals that really make communication dynamic.
It's like you're so busy rehearsing your lines in your head that you forget to actually engage with the other person.
Exactly.
You miss those opportunities to react, to improvise,
Right.
to really make the conversation come alive.
Active listening helps you to pick up on those nuances, the tone of voice, the body language, the pauses, the unspoken questions.
You're reading between the lines.
Exactly. And it allows you to respond in a way that's both appropriate and engaging.
So it's about being present in the conversation.
Yes.
Not just waiting for your turn to speak.
That's right.
Now, one thing that James and Clara didn't explicitly mention, but that I think is really relevant here, is this idea of cultural awareness.
Oh, that's a great point.
English is a global language.
It is.
And different cultures have different communication styles.
Absolutely. What might be considered polite or friendly in one context could be interpreted very differently in another.
Right. It's like learning the unspoken rules of a new game.
Yeah.
You need to understand those customs and that etiquette to play effectively.
That's a good analogy.
And that awareness can make a huge difference in how you're perceived and how well you connect with people from different backgrounds.
I remember a time when I was working on a project with a colleague from Japan.
And we were both fluent in English, but our communication styles were so different that it created a lot of misunderstandings early on.
I can imagine. What kind of differences did you notice?
Well, for example, I'm very direct in my communication style.
Okay.
But my colleague was much more indirect. And so I would often misinterpret his politeness as hesitation or a lack of interest.
Oh, wow.
When in reality, he was just trying to be respectful.
It's amazing how these subtle cultural differences can have such a big impact.
They really can. And it just highlights the importance of not just learning the language, but learning about the cultures where that language is spoken.
It's like adding another layer of depth to your
Yeah.
understanding of English. You're not just learning words and grammar, you're learning about the people who use those words and grammar.
Yeah, well said. And I think that's a perfect way to kind of wrap up what we've been talking about today. Fluency is so much more than just speaking perfectly or having this huge vocabulary.
It's about using language as this bridge to understanding, to connection, to personal growth.
Yeah, it's about embracing the journey, the challenges, the triumphs, the constant evolution that comes with learning a language.
Absolutely. And even though James and Clara focused on English in their podcast, I think a lot of these principles apply to learning any language.
I agree.
It's about cultivating that curiosity, that openness to new experiences, that willingness to step outside of your comfort zone and embrace the unknown.
So as you reflect on everything that we've talked about today, what's one small step you feel inspired to take to boost your own fluency?
That's a great question to think about. Maybe it's committing to thinking in English for a few minutes each day, or giving that shadowing technique a try.
Right.
Remember, even small, consistent efforts can lead to remarkable results over time.
And who knows, maybe someday you'll be sharing your own fluency tips, inspiring others on their language learning journey.
That would be wonderful. And with that, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the world of fluency. Happy learning, everyone. And until next time, keep exploring the amazing power of language.